Hello everyone and welcome back to World History. Today we're going to be talking about the early river civilizations of the Indus Valley as well as China. As we go through, I just want to remind you of some really important things. Make sure you're taking notes, write down any questions or important information you think you need to know, as well as taking down any important vocabulary or highlighted words. As we go through, make sure to pay attention to these three symbols. If you see the star, then most likely these things are part of your star testing or state standards. If you see the brain, it means we're talking about prior knowledge, things that you should already know or that we have discussed before in class. And if you see the bell, it means this is related to testing or important bell ringers or things to remember. Today we're going to be talking about the river civilization. Specifically, we're going to focus on the Indus Valley and early China, as well as look at our timeline and overview. So what exactly are river civilizations? Well, we talked about the first one in our last video, Samar, or commonly known as Mesopotamia. However, it's not the only one. There are a variety of these types of river civilizations. So first off, we have the Indus Valley. It was found to be around the upper portion of early India. We have early China, which took place around the Yellow River, and we'll talk more about that, as well as the Egypt. These are the three big ones that we have besides Mesopotamia, which is right here, which is the one we talked about last week. So again, why are these places so important? Well, early civilizations could only thrive because of the rivers. Rivers provided controlled flooding, irrigation, land for farming and agriculture, especially in places like the Fertile Crescent, which is right about here, which had lots of fertile land, stretches from the Nile all the way up to Mesopotamia. And these flooding systems allowed for diverse farming as well as the development of cities. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Indus River Valley. So geographically, the Indus River Valley was found in the Indian subcontinent. That is this area right here. It was along the Indus River, which is where it gets its name. This stretches from the Arabian Sea all the way down here, all the way to the Gulf of Cambay, all the way up to the Himalayas. So it's a very large civilization for the time. And the biggest thing to remember is the economy of the Indus River Valley. It was the center of the world at the time. Like I said, you have the China over here, Mesopotamia over here, and Egypt over here. So it really was right in the middle. And so people had to go through it in order to get to the other parts, allowing for trade to flourish across the area. Next thing we have is an important aspect of the Indus River Valley is monsoons. So monsoons were considered both a blessing and a curse. Basically, a monsoon is a type of hurricane. So it's very similar in nature, though it blows in the opposite direction. So in winter, you would have dry air that would cover the land, making it not so easy for farming. While in the summer, you would have warm air blowing from the southwest. This warm air would allow for a fertile growing land, while the dry, cold winters would make it almost inhospitable. The biggest concern was the cycle of weather of the monsoons was not very predictable. While I say winter and summer, it could be in the middle of summer when you have a monsoon hit, which would allow for a lot of time of surplus and famine. What that means is you would have years of lots and lots of food and growing, and then you would have years of nothing. So for example, so it made it really difficult to keep a civilization going because they didn't always know how long they would have land that was farmable versus land that wasn't farmable. The culture of the Indus Valley was really interesting. First off, this is one of the earliest large civilizations we find. Mesopotamia was a really cool example, but it was a lot of city-states. Indus Valley was more cohesive, though it had a lot of different ideas. So the biggest city was Harappa. This was the first real urban city. Developed around 23,000 BCE and lasted until 1750 BCE, which is a very long time, and over had 35,000 people. That's very large for one of these early civilizations. And it's not the only one. There are other cities like this all along the river. This made it very easy to produce lots of crops and to allow for trade. it had a lot of, because of its farmable land, you have a lot of farmers as well as artisans, as well as herders who domesticated animals. Also, they had one of the first early writing systems, which we still can't decode. So if you look right here, this is one of the early images. So this is the word, and then this is the image. And so we do not know completely this language. And so it's really hard to know a lot about the Indus River Valley because we don't have a language, we don't have the language decoded. So however, just like most civilizations, it fell in decline, but it practically disappeared overnight, and we don't really know why. So remember, they had huge cities, lots of people, and plenty of trade, but just overnight, it kind of vanished. So initial thoughts was that it was a war between tribes or a natural disaster. One thought was that it was a disease. There was skeletons in the streets and abandoned homes. So many thought, there was a plague that affected and people kind of abandoned the cities. Another big one is earthquake. We had fallen homes on buried skeletons, which also show that there might have been a disaster. And the last one is flooding. Remember, you have that unpredictable flooding. They don't know when a monsoon's going to hit. So it could have hit the wrong time and destroyed the cities. Till today, we still don't know why the Indus River Valley civilization kind of disappeared. But we do know that it kind of happened very quickly. It went from being a very populated area with lots of people to very quickly kind of just no longer there, which really impacted the other civilizations around it. Across the country, in China, you have the early Chinese developing, and they developed between two rivers. So you have two main rivers right here. We have the Huanghe and the Yangtze. These are the two longest rivers in China. And this area in between was incredibly fertile. These two rivers kind of created this little strip of land that was great for sowing and doing things. One of the most important part of these rivers was the louse. So louse is a fine grain, windblown yellow soil found near the rivers. And this grain was found through all here. So that's why these rivers are actually called yellow rivers. And just like Indus Valley, they have their goods and their bads. So another name for the river was China Sorrow. What would often happen is the louse would build up. And while it was good to produce really good soil for fertilization, it would often lead to flooding. So it would build up, blocking a part of the river, right? So it would block like right here. And then what would happen is the water would flood in and flood in and flood in. And then it would break and it would go all over, flooding the area completely. And this would often lead to years of devastation. And so it was called China Sorrow because while it gave great abundance of food and fertile land, it also led to the deaths of many many villages and cities, as well as many peoples at this time. China would actually end up falling to nomadic enemies. So it was so there were people who lived up here in the highland or the steppes, and they would come down and attack and try to steal food or animals or people in order to provide for themselves because this land up here wasn't as fertile. So one thing we do know about the early China is the dynasties. So dynasty is a type of historical ruling period of a civilization. So usually to have a dynasty, you would have one kind of main figure or family, and they would be the rulers or monarchs of that dynasty. And who was a leader depended completely on whether or not they had divine appointment. So they had divine appointment. If things were going good in China, then the dynasty was flourishing, it was doing well. If it was going bad, the people were starting to kind of break away and be like, I don't know about this. But the first dynasty we have is the Zhai. And for many years, the Zhai was believed to be a mythical, not real dynasty. That was actually just a story to kind of give the impression of what a dynasty is supposed to be like. However, we found there were found things called dragon bones, and people would find them buried, and they would dig them up and they would grind them up and drink them as medicine. However, it was actually found that these are oracle bones, and that means they're they're different animal bones inscribed with ancient writing of China on it that told stories. It told the story of the Zhai dynasty. And so this was actually a real dynasty, and people were kind of destroying their own history by grinding up and drinking them as medicine. However, we did eventually figure out that these were not dragon bones, but oracle bones. And that just means it's a bone that the oracles or the scholars and scribes of the time would write stories on. Another big part of this dynasty was builders and soldiers. The Zai were military, the kings were all military commanders. So this was a very military-based society. And so people did things for the military as kind of the foundation of the society. And so one of the big things they did was public works, and that were huge governmental projects typically used to develop urban or urban settings. And so one of the biggest things this dynasty, the Zai dynasty, did was develop these public works using their military connections. So what was the culture of this time? So like I said, the Zai dynasty was the main ruling class of the time. And they had a familiar hierarchy. So not only was the Zai the head of the whole country, but the actual, each family was designated by a hierarchy. So you had elders, wise people, so older people in the family that had kind of lived a long time, and under them would be parents or kind of the middle-aged group, and then under them were children. And a big thing, a part of this this age was faithful piety. So this was a respectful duty and unquestioning obedience to one's parents or elders. So it basically meant that the child would do anything the parent said. If they believed that the parent knew everything, was all-knowing in this regard, and that they should follow with absolute obedience. There's a practice of honor. So if you disobeyed your parents, it was considered dishonorable, and you could actually be shunned or removed from a tribe or a village. Another big part is Chinese culture. Like I said, they had early writings on these oracle bones, as well as pottery and art. One of the first generations to do bronze art. Usually this bronze art was like people, like up here you see this, this Buddhist man praying, as well as you would have pots with different animals. One of the most popular designs were dragons, which is why we often associate dragons with China, because it was one of the earliest popular designs and something really important to kind of the mythos and the beliefs of China. So eventually it would come to an end. It was attacked by Wu Wang, who was a rival kind of rebel leader who started his own dynasty. So what you'll find when it comes to China is not that China itself disappears as a civilization, but that each dynasty falls and another one rises as different things happen. So like I said, the most important part of a dynasty is that divine rule. So if the gods are happy, they're going to let the land flourish. The people are going to have good crops. There's not going to be flooding. There's not going to be war. However, if the divine ruler is no longer supposed to be the divine ruler, if there should be a new dynasty coming in, what's going to happen is they'll see things like flooding and war and poverty and famine. And so that was kind of their sign. And so people would begin to revolt when they believed that a dynasty had come to an end. And this results in these rising and falls of dynasties, which we'll talk a little bit later when we get into classic China. A big thing I want to talk about is the Silk Road. So earlier I had that picture of kind of all the different early civilizations and how they connected. And so a big thing we're going to talk about is called the Silk Road. And we'll talk about this more later when we get into trade. But an important thing to remember is the Silk Road connected all of these countries together to allow for a trade network, which is a system in which people interact and exchange goods for currency and need. So China, the reason it's called the Silk Road is because of China. China would produce these beautiful silk garments and sheets, and it was basically used as currency. It was incredibly difficult to make and beautifully made, and was very durable, so it lasted a very long time. So it was so it's called the Silk Road because silk would be the main thing that would go up and down, and they would use it as money. So they would give it to warlords in order to pacify them. They would use it to gain riches and gold. Like silk was more important and worth more money than gold at this time. So this is the main axis of trade for over 2,000 years. And we'll talk more about that again when we get further in. But I wanted to kind of reference this here and kind of help put in your mind of what it actually meant that all of these civilizations began connected. So eventually we'll have this beautiful chain of civilizations going from China all the way to Rome. But for now, we only really have three. We have China, we talked about the Indus Valley, that's in India, and we'll talk about Egypt in our next video. And those are the three big civilizations that are currently going on. However, eventually we'll have this huge civilizations all across Africa to Asia Minor to India to Asia. They kind of all connect together and create this beautiful tapestry of trade. And it starts here in China with the silk, with the travel, with the creation of these early civilizations, would build the foundation of what is the Silk Road in our trade system. Okay, so that's basically it. So let's kind of go over everything we've talked about so far. So we started all the way back in 1500 BCE with the end of the Ice Age. We went from hunting gathering to the development of cities. Today we talked about the introduction of the Bronze Age, as well as the move from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. The Indus Valley would be a main civilization for a multitude of years, all the way from 2500 BCE to 1700 BCE, as well as the development of the Shang Dynasty, the first major civilization of China. So before you leave, let's think about some of our early things. Some of our early civilizations were a product of rivers. You need rivers in order to have these early civilizations. The Indus Valley was one of our first ones, developed new cultures, new cities, as well as China with the development of dynasties and the introduction of the Shang, which many believe to be a myth, but realize actually it is true. Remember, we still see again that divine rule. Divine rule is a big aspect of early civilization. Most leaders at this time are going to be divinely appointed. The gods are going to be the one that say this person should be the leader versus somebody else. And also, like I said, Silk Road is the basis of early civilization and what would develop of our trade network. Before you leave, we're going to talk one more time about civilization, which means civitas, or city in Latin. And we talked about this question last week. What were the factors that create the rise and the fall of civilizations? Looking back at this on the Indus Valley and China, think about that question again. Make sure to go take your post-lecture assessment. Go take your post-lecture assessment, and I will see you all in class. Have a great day.